everyone. In this video, we're going to be talking about the integumentary system, and integumentary is sort of just a fancy way for saying skin. And generally, when we talk about the integumentary system, we're talking about a couple of specific structures. First, we have the cutaneous membrane, which is the skin, consists of the epidermis and the dermis. And oftentimes we consider the hypodermis as well. It's actually not part of the integumentary system, but this is the most appropriate place to discuss it, so we'll mention it a couple of times. And then also we have accessory structures, and the accessory structures include hair, nails, and exocrine glands, of which there are multiple types. The basic functions of the integumentary system include protection from impact chemicals, infection, loss of body fluids, temperature maintenance, which is basically exchanging heat with the environment and regulating the extent to which it's occurring, nutrient storage, things like vitamin D3 and lipids, sensory reception, which would be based on the use of various types of neurons, dendrites generally, that appear in the skin. And this is for touch, pain, pressure, and temperature, and then the information will be relayed to the central nervous system. And then lastly, excretion of things like salt, water, and organic waste products. Let's start off by considering the cutaneous membrane, the layers that make up the cutaneous membrane. From the most outside or exterior of the body, we have the epidermis, and the epidermis is avascular, meaning that there are no blood vessels that run through this layer. All the blood vessels are actually deeper in the dermis. The epidermis is divided into strata, and the word strata is just basically sort of a fancy word for layer. And there are two types of skin: thick skin, which is 5 strata, and thin skin, which is 4 strata. And one thing I just want to sort of emphasize is that a strata does not indicate a single layer of cells. Rather, strata could be made up of varying numbers of cell layers, but the characteristics of each strata are different. Now, you notice that the base layer of the epidermis is not flat. Rather, it consists of these sort of wavy lines that make up epidermal ridges. And interestingly, they're called epidermal ridges when we're considering them from the epidermal side. And then the next layer below the epidermis is the dermis. And from the dermal perspective are upward projections named dermal papillae. And we'll cover the specifics of each of those in a little bit. Now, the dermis, as we mentioned, is vascular. It also contains nerve endings, and lymphatic vessels. It's primarily made of connective tissue and has a couple of different layers itself. Below the dermis is the hypodermis, which we mentioned is not part of the integumentary system, but we're going to consider it in this video. And then below that will be our underlying organs. Okay, so now let's consider the epidermis in more detail. So we're going to work our way from the very base of the epidermis at the epidermal ridges and sort of move towards the exterior. So the epidermis, as we mentioned, is divided into either 4 or 5 strata, depending upon which area of the body we're specifically referring to. And it turns out that the thick skin only covers the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, and everywhere else basically is thin skin. So we're going to include the 5 strata in this discussion, noting that one of them is only going to be present on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. So the very first layer, the very bottommost layer, is called the stratum basal or stratum germinativum. It has 2 different names, of course. And so basically this is a single layer of cells. They're primarily stem cells, and it's generally cuboidal or columnar epithelia. And we can actually also call these cells keratinocytes, but I'm choosing to label them just as epithelial cells at this point. So in this layer, the cells are connected to the basement membrane by hemidesmosomes, and they're connected to each other by desmosomes, and that's something that's going to continue from here all the way to the very outermost layer of the skin. And we also have a small abundance of melanocytes, which is going to produce the coloring of the skin. So because this is a layer of stem cells, a cell will divide, and basically one of the 2 cells will remain a stem cell, and the other cell will differentiate into a daughter cell, and as it does so, it's going to move upward to the next layer. These cells, as they move upward and differentiate, will fill with keratin, which is a durable protein that's basically waterproof, and it is what largely contributes to the waterproof nature of the skin. As we move upward from the stratum basale, we move to the stratum spinosum. So this layer basically receives a daughter cell from the layer below, and as the daughter cells accumulate, they will ultimately push upward, and the cells sort of accumulate in this layer to be about 8 to 10 layers thick. There may be a small amount of additional mitosis occurring in this layer, but if there is, it's the very last layer where it's happening. None of the more superficial layers will have any. The cells begin to assume a squamous-like shape, and they also start to accumulate their coloring. So we mentioned that the melanocytes below are producing the coloring, which is called melanin. And basically the melanocytes will exocytose granules of melanin, and then the granules are endocytosed by the cells in this layer, and then ultimately the granules will rupture, and the coloring of melanin sort of shields the nucleus, particularly on the apical surface or the superficial side of the cell, so that any sun exposure won't necessarily damage the DNA that's present in the nucleus. Cells moving upward from this layer move to stratum granulosum, or the grainy layer, and this layer is very far from the dermis, and so even though the cells that are below this layer can obtain nutrients from the dermis, this layer is too far away. So these cells aren't going to be able to receive oxygen or anything else to sustain them, so they're going to lose their organelles and die. The next layer is the stratum lucidum, or glassy layer. This is the layer that we mentioned is only found in thick skin. The cells of this layer appear transparent, and there are probably only about 2 or 3 layers of cells here. This is a very small number of layers. And then lastly, we have the stratum corneum. So this is the most superficial or exterior layer made of stratified squamous epithelial cells. And at this point, all the cells are dead and flattened, and they've accumulated a lot of keratin, which is, again, what gives the skin its waterproof characteristics. It takes about 2 to 4 weeks to move into this layer, and about 2 weeks to shed, and the skin cells will shed in sheets. We mentioned that they're connected by desmosomes, and so desmosomes are what contribute to the skin coming off in sort of flakes, or if you think of having a sunburn and it peeling, as opposed to it coming off in a fine powder. Also, just want to mention that the function of the epidermal ridges, we mentioned that there's this sort of wavy baseline. The epidermal ridges, which technically is even though the arrow is pointing from below, is the sort of view downward from the epidermis. Basically, they increase the surface area for nutrient absorption, which we know is going to occur from the dermal layer. Now, overall, the epidermis ranges from about 0.5 to 1.5 millimeters in thickness. So it's actually very, very thin. 0.5 millimeters would be an example, would be like over the eyelid, and then the 1.5 at its thickest would be the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. Okay, so now let's consider the dermis. The dermis is deeper than the epidermis, and so we'll draw a wavy line again and sort of remember that the epidermis is everything, all those cells that are above it. So there are 2 layers that make up the dermis. The papillary layer is the layer that's most closely connected to the epidermis, and beneath it is the reticular layer. So there are 2 different types of connective tissue that are present here. The papillary layer consists largely of loose connective tissue, and it supports and nourishes the epidermis. And the reticular layer, which is about 80% of the dermis, is made of dense irregular connective tissue, which contains elastic and collagen fibers. So elastic fibers produce flexibility of the skin, and collagen limits the flexibility of the skin. So we have the ability for the skin to stretch and then also sort of return to its original position and not be stretched out. Both layers contain blood vessels, nerves, lymphatic vessels, and accessory organs. And accessory organs, we mean things like sweat glands, sebaceous glands, hair follicles, and things like that. Now, the perspective of looking at this wavy baseline from below, we call that dermal papillae, And the function of the dermal papillae, similarly, is to increase the surface area of the skin, but also it increases friction and grip security. And it may be familiar to consider the ridge pattern on fingertips. That is what makes up fingerprints. So fingerprints are genetically predetermined and they last for a lifetime, so they don't change over the course of a lifetime. And then below the dermis, we mentioned, is the hypodermis, and is relevant to consider the basic functions of the hypodermis. So the hypodermis stabilizes the position of skin relative to the underlying organs. It also permits movement. So if, for example, you were to flex a bicep, the skin over the elbow is able to move easily and then sort of return to its original position. The hypodermis is made of adipose tissue and connective tissue. So if there's weight gain, sort of especially unfavorable weight gain, then the adipose tissue accumulates in the hypodermis. And the last thing I want to consider relative to skin is the skin coloring. And it's based on two things: pigmentation and dermal circulation. So pigmentation, there are two pigments that we want to consider. One of them we mentioned already, which is melanin, comes from melanocytes. And the amount of melanin can increase with sun exposure. And subsequently, there will be an increase in the precursor to vitamin D synthesis. And then ultimately increased conversion to vitamin D3, which is calcitriol, in the liver and the kidneys. And this allows for increased calcium absorption in the small intestine. We also have keratin, and keratin is an orange-yellow pigment that's present in orange-colored vegetables such as carrots, and basically it accumulates in the stratum corneum. And interestingly, if there's an excessive consumption of orange-colored vegetables, then the skin can take on an orange-like color. So sort of reminds me of the expression "you are what you eat" is a little bit literal in some cases. The other factor that contributes to skin coloring is dermal circulation. And so basically, since we know that the blood vessels are in the dermal layer, if there's an increase in blood flow to the dermal layer, we get vasodilation and a reddening of the skin. So this could happen as a result of being in hot temperatures. The blood vessels dilate and become closer to the surface of the skin, so the skin appears flushed. Now, I just want to make another point about this. So the fact that the blood vessels are there is sort of what gives the skin a pinkish color in the first place. And because individuals may have varying amounts of melanin and melanin production, if there's an increase in melanin, so there's more melanin in certain individuals, darker skinned individuals particularly, then there would be decreased visibility of the red color. But in individuals that are more fair skinned, there's less melanin, which means that the red color is much more visible. And then conversely, if we had a decrease in blood flow, so particularly if it was very cold outside, we'd have vasoconstriction of the vessels in the dermal layer, which can contribute to pale coloring. This is also true if individuals are sick, particularly hypoperfusion. If they're hypotensive, then we'll get less blood flow to the skin, and therefore the patient can appear pale. All right, and then the last few minutes, I just want to spend time covering the accessory structures, the hair, the nails, and the exocrine glands. So hair is a non-living structure found on most surfaces of the skin, and it's produced in hair follicles. We'll draw the surface of the skin. So we have the epidermis, and then the hair follicle extends into the dermis. The hair follicle is also connected to the erector pili muscle. We'll mention that in a minute. So the hair can be divided into the hair shaft and the hair root. And then at the very bottom, we have the hair papilla, which is basically a peg of connective tissue that contains capillary and nerve. So cell division occurs at the hair papilla, and the process is very similar to that of the stem cells in the epidermis. So we have formation of the daughter cells. Daughter cells are going to push towards the surface and they're going to undergo keratinization. So they basically become filled with keratin, which makes them waterproof, and then they also are going to die. So the hair root is pre-keratinization and the hair shaft is post-keratinization. Hair typically grows for 2 to 5 years, and then it will take a short break. It'll shed the hair, so the hair will fall out, and then it'll wait sort of, maybe a month or a couple of months, and then it'll start to grow again. The hair papilla is also the location of pigment production by melanocytes, and the pigment production actually decreases with age, which is why older adults have white hair or gray hair instead of the color of their original hair. And then just as an aside, function of the erector pili muscle in response to anger or cold causes the hair to stand on end. So the overall functions of the hair are to protect the head from UV light, cushion a light blow to the head, which I know sounds a little silly, but I think we're imagining something very, very minor, and insulating the skull. And then also hair in the nose and on the eyelashes guard the entry of pathogens into the body. Nails. So nails form on the dorsal surfaces of fingers and toes, and they protect the fingertips and tips of the toes and limit distortion secondary to mechanical stress. So we'll just sort of draw a quick nail on a finger or a toe, whichever you prefer. So the point where the nail appears to emerge from the skin is the cuticle. The nail beyond that on the top is called the nail body. The nail bed is the part of the finger or the toe that the nail sits on, and the nail root is the part of the nail that's actually below the surface of the skin. One thing that's interesting about nail roots is, there are certain types of injuries where the entire fingernail can be pulled out, and lots of times they'll reinsert the fingernail into the space, because if the fingernail is not reinserted, then sometimes the nail won't actually grow back. So it sort of needs that reminder or that space of the nail being there in order to continue to produce the nail for the future. All right, and then lastly, we'll consider the exocrine glands. And there are 2 types of glands that I want to consider. Sebaceous glands are oil glands, and they basically discharge oil onto the surface of the skin, which is kind of interesting because this occurs by exocytosis. And once the oil is on the skin, we call it sebum. And the sebum functions, among other things, to protect against growth of bacteria. And then the sweat glands, there are multiple types of sweat glands, but to summarize, they release about 99% water, along with salt, some organic nutrients, and urea. The primary function of the sweat glands is to cool the body, and then also if the skin is sweaty, it can prevent some microorganisms from contacting the surface of the skin because it's on the more slippery side. All right, so that concludes our overview and discussion on the integumentary system. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.